Everybody, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Nora Burnett Abrams. This is Andrea Anderson. We are the co-curators of the exhibition Postscript, Writing After Conceptual Art. And we are so delighted to have you here. We inaugurated the exhibition on October 12th with a series of performances by different participants in the exhibition. And so we're really pleased to kind of bookend the exhibition, which closes next Sunday, with another series of events that reminds us of the kind of range of works that result from appropriative practices, which is, of course, central to this whole exhibition. And we really conceived today's program as an opportunity to explore yet another medium. We certainly have works of film, video, sculpture, painting, photography, drawing, and we wanted to draw out the kind of performative medium in which found text is borrowed and remixed, and many other things. So with that,
when we were planning this exhibition, we thought a great deal about a lot of historical works that foreground the primacy of printed technology, whether books or magazines. But as in our planning, we were struck by the number of works by contemporary artists who were relocating printed text to more performative contexts. This presented certain curatorial challenges for a fixed traveling gallery exhibition. And for that reason, consequently, there were a number of works by artists, including Emma Kay, Sue Tompkins, Paul Chan, Will Holder, whom we are delighted to have here today, that we could not include in the gallery, in that gallery exhibition. So today is really an extension of what is on view elsewhere in the museum today. And like many of the pieces in the museum, many of the talks that we'll hear today are informed, they're fashioned, and they're shaped in some measure by new technology and new media. But what we'll be listening to today also takes place in a much longer history of orality, which has always been predicated on repetition. So we are delighted to have you and to welcome you to this echo chamber of sorts. And I am delighted to welcome our first artist, whose work includes performance, sound, writing artist books, painting. He's the co-founder of Primary Information with Miriam Katzif and No Input Books with Daniel Snelson. I'm delighted to welcome James Hoff to the stage.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming and I guess giving up your brunches to hear us talk this morning. As mentioned in the introduction, I do a number of things, from publishing to kind of a more standard studio practice to writing to sound work to performance. There are a few things that, a few concerns rather, that run through all of those different mediums or practices. And I would say the primary one at this point centers around distribution. Oh, the stand left. Sorry. It's okay. Centers around distribution, and distribution in a few different, thinking about distribution in a few different ways. Of course, the sort of standard notion of distribution, which is, how do you get a book from New York City to Denver, for instance. But also, more widely speaking, distribution in a way of thinking about how you get artwork into a space, or how you get words onto a page, or how you get an idea to distribute through a culture or a subculture or a gallery or what have you. So with that in mind, I want to speak a little bit today about some concerns or some things I've been thinking about over the last few years as I sort of straddle through these different practices. Primarily, I'm going to talk about viruses, both sort of biological viruses and computer viruses, as you can see over here. So before we get too far into the future, I kind of want to go back and talk about Lord Timothy Dexter. Lord Timothy Dexter was an 18th century eccentric. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background knowledge about Lord Timothy before we get to this fascinating book that he published at the end of the 18th century. So Timothy Dexter was born kind of a layman. He didn't have much education, but fortunately, sometime I think in his 20s, he married into wealth. And with that newfound wealth and that newfound privilege in life and status that comes with wealth, or at least marrying into it, he decided he was going to become a businessman. And he sort of embarked on a number of endeavors that are sort of they don't really make much sense, but he did all the wrong things right, if that makes sense. So, and there's a huge long line of them. I'm just going to touch on a few that deal with distribution. So he decided he was going to become a shipper, which of course in the 18th century you did with boats. So he built a few boats, and the first things he decided to ship or to distribute. He decided to ship mittens, winter mittens, and hot water bottles to the West Indies. As we all know, the West Indians don't really need mittens, and they don't really need hot water bottles. But he was lucky because someone was probably more entrepreneurial than him, took those items and redistributed them elsewhere. So, or at least the mittens, someone bought them and sold them to people in Siberia. So he made a good buck off that. And then someone bought the bottles and they used them to store syrup, maple syrup and other things in. So he ended up sort of becoming a successful businessman in this sort of very unconventional way. And at one point, someone as a lark even suggested that he sell coals to Newcastle, which of course we all know this phrase. And he did it. And he was even lucky in this endeavor because right before the ships landed, or before the coal got there, there was a coal strike. So they needed coal. So he ended up making a bunch of money off this whimsical notion, which was more of a joke that was suggested to him that he took seriously, by shipping coals to Newcastle. So this was the sort of businessman he was. He actually wasn't very well liked in the community. He was sort of a rapscallion, I guess. And he sort of didn't really like his wife that much after a while. He kind of just decided that he sort of decided that he just didn't want to believe she was alive anymore, so he told everyone she was dead, and that the nagging drunk woman around the house was actually her ghost. So he, as you can imagine, he didn't have very many friends in the community, and he didn't have very many loved ones that sort of really liked him very much either. So he was sort of unliked because of his unconventional ways. So to counteract that, I think he got a little bitter. So he decided to write a book. And the book was written in the 1890s, and there's no one really knows when it was published because it was a sort of private press. He printed it himself, basically. So I think 1798 to 1802 is the range. And so the book is called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, or The Truth in a Homespun Dress. Now, what he decided to do in this book, there's several interesting things from this book. What he decided to do, basically, because he was so unliked, he decided to sort of write this book, which told about his life, and for him, sort of got some retribution against the knowing ones, which were the people in his community that he didn't like, and that didn't like him. So it's a bit of a sort of screed on politics and religion, while at the same time talking a little bit about his life. So that in and of itself is not so interesting. But what is interesting is that being the true eccentric that he was, he refused to use any punctuation marks whatsoever. So here you have, on your left side, you can see a page from the book. So there's no punctuation marks. And he also didn't really seem to have a great grasp on capitalization. So he just sort of capitalized words at random. So you kind of can't really tell where the sentences end or begin. But there's no sentences because there's no periods. Which I think is quite fascinating, and also because he wasn't extremely well educated, a lot of the language in the book was slang terms, and there's a lot of misspelling. So it's quite a fun little read. And what I like about this, as we'll see in a second, is that it sort of accidentally and superficially presupposes a lot of things that happened a couple centuries later in the 20th century with writing, with the lack of punctuation marks, for instance, that you find in maybe James Joyce or E. Cummings, or the sort of book-length run-on sentence that you would find in Balhumil Robble or someone like that. But more interesting than that, for me at least, is that in the second edition, the book kind of took off and became popular. as everything in life that he did sort of ended up becoming a success by accident. So they found a real publisher, or a real publisher decided to publish it, but they said, you know what, Lord Timothy, we really need you to put punctuation in here. So he says, okay, I'm going to put punctuation in. So he puts it all in the appendix, which you can see here on the right. So here is all the punctuation marks. I won't read this here, but he has a note basically curmudgeonly saying, I had to put the punctuation marks in, here they are, put them wherever you want. There's more than enough here. So in this way, he kind of presupposes, like a relational aesthetics or something like this. But more interestingly, I think, and this will be a theme that sort of runs through much of my talk, is the sort of superficial relationship between something like this and concrete poetry, which is sort of maybe one of my first loves, and which sort of the thing that sort of got me interested in language at a very young age. So this I've always enjoyed because it reminds me a lot of typewriter poetry and of concrete poetry. Of course, it wasn't done on a typewriter. It was pre-typewriter. But in particular, it reminds me a lot of this Chopin poem, which was written in 1965 and published in the Something Else Press Concrete Poetry Anthology, which came out just a few years later. So this is Lord Timothy Dexter. I think we've probably covered him enough, but there's a lot more interesting stories to go into with him, but I think we'll have to leave it for now. But taking away from that, I think the biggest point for what we're talking about now is maybe just this idea of grammar, and the idea, his sort of not using grammar as a transgressive act against like social custom or against literary custom, which sort of takes us into, since we're going to be talking a lot about viruses and languages, we kind of need to start by talking about William Burroughs, who is probably the person who popularized more than anyone the idea of viral language, or language as a virus. And Burroughs himself, as we all know, had trouble with his wife too. He also had a lot of trouble with grammar. Now Burroughs, as many of you probably know, he also had trouble with smiling in photographs. He believed that language was a virus, in that you're not born speaking clearly. So language comes in from the outside, it invades the body, it becomes parasitic, and then it becomes benign. It infests the brain, and then it's through language that we start to formulate thought and how we communicate clearly. So basically, he thought that language created walls in the brain, and grammar in particular was a control device for the help. Basically was used to control creativity, or in some ways controlled creativity, and controlled how we thought, talked, and wrote clearly. So his response to that, of course, was to create formal strategies to knock down those walls. And as we all know, he's sort of famous for his cut-up techniques and things like this. But I think more importantly, it's just this idea that he sort of wed the idea of language and virus together in an intellectual capacity and in a sort of pop cultural capacity. I think Laurie Anderson probably took it to the next level a couple of years later. But language was acting virally long before Burroughs came and said that, and there are a few instances in the real world of language and virus sort of wedding themselves together, and I want to talk about two of them. And the first one I want to talk about is syndromes. And we all sort of know what syndromes are. They've been around probably forever, I guess, but became popular also in the 19th century, and then more popular in the 20th century with sort of Freudian psychoanalytic thought. There's sort of like three different types of syndromes, or at least I like to think of them in three different ways. The first one is like an actual syndrome that you actually is a real illness, like a neurological illness, such as alien hand syndrome. This is taken from National Enquirer, 1984, and it's alien hand syndrome is a neurological illness where your hand is thought to sort of possess a brain of itself and will start to do things that you can't control it, essentially. Typically, it just does sort of, at least in terms of how it's been documented in the last 50 years, it sort of just does things like this, you know. It's sort of a handy version of Tourette's or something, is a way of thinking about it. But it makes for a good story. And that's one of the things that I like about syndromes, and I think it's important in talking about language and syndromes, is that most syndromes have these sort of outrageous, like really outrageous titles, like alien hand syndrome or brain fag syndrome or uncomfortable hair syndrome. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of them, like this has a Latin name as well, but I'm sure, you know, you would never remember the Latin name because most people don't speak Latin. So we have the first instance of a syndrome. I'm going to go through three. And the first one is where the syndrome sort of is like a real illness, you know, that's actually manifested itself physically in the body, even though it has an outrageous name that sort of helps distribute it through the language, so, and through popular culture. So many will probably recognize alien hand syndrome as a sort of a vital component to a movie called Evil Dead 2, where a hand tries to, which is going to come up here soon, I think. So I'll leave it for that. But the second type of syndrome is a syndrome that sort of describes a social norm or social convention, and those are a lot more off the cuff. And so here we have social media remorse syndrome, which I think most people probably have experienced at least once in their life. And that's where, you know, you send off that email, you make that Facebook post, you do that Twitter post, you do something that you immediately regret. And then you have remorse for it, and then you can't sleep, and that causes social media remorse syndrome. So this type of syndrome is more of like a syndrome that's, it's not dealing so much with a local culture, but dealing with a broader sort of cultural norm. So these are more often sort of off the cuff, like missing white woman syndrome would be another one. Photographing the ruins of Detroit syndrome is one that I really like right now. The list kind of goes on and on. But I think maybe the one that's most important to talk about for this conversation is shrinking penis syndrome. And this is a syndrome that is a psychosomatic illness which doesn't exist. It only exists in the brain, in which the title, in this case shrinking penis, acts both as a description of the syndrome and as the point of germination for the syndrome. So shrinking penis syndrome is a syndrome that's sort of touched on most continents of the world at one point or another. But in Asia, in the 70s, it was quite popular. It was the sort of syndrome of the day, basically. It infected tens of thousands of people. And it's basically shrinking penis syndrome, as you can probably tell from the title. It's also called genital retraction syndrome, is this idea that the penis in grown men is going to start to retract into the body, up into the stomach. And men were terrified of this happening. So basically what happened is someone caught shrinking penis syndrome. They got paranoid. They told someone else. And then that person caught shrinking penis syndrome. And then the next person, and it just kept spreading. So what I think is quite fascinating, and there's a sort of long list of these types of syndromes as well. For a long time, they were called folk illnesses or culture-bound illnesses because they affect like a very particular local culture. Is that point that I made earlier about the title, which is pretty outrageous, I think we can all agree, sort of acting as both the germinator of the syndrome and as the description of the syndrome simultaneously. So the next thing I want to talk about in this whole melding of language and virus is the computer virus. So here we have the source code for a computer virus called "Your PC is now stoned." And this was sort of popular in the mid 80s, and it took on many, many, many different forms. Now, what originally drew me, just like with Lord Timothy Dexter, to this was its sort of superficial relationship or its graphic relationship to concrete poetry. In particular, I always thought it always reminded me a lot of this poem by Ernst Jandl called "Film," and also by this work by Dan Graham, which I wouldn't call concrete poetry, but clearly has a relationship to concrete poetry, called "Figurative." what's interesting about Dan Graham's piece is that most people probably know this piece. It seems to be one of his more popular pieces. It's been on the cover of Artforum and all this stuff. Was that it was distributed into a magazine called Harper's Bazaar, March 1968, and it was, figurative is obviously playing off the Tampax ad on the left and the bra ad on the right. So this was a sort of central concern of the artists of that generation, was the idea of distribution of works through the page, through a book, through mass culture magazines and things like this. So this is a sort of highlight of that sort of approach and strategy. But what most people don't know is that the Ernst Jandl poem here appeared in the exact same issue just a few pages later. And that's not to detract anything from Dan's work at all, but I think quite often it gets misread for his tenacity of being able to place it in the magazine. But if you actually look at the history of that magazine, it had a fondness for concrete poetry and experimental art in general, and had like essays by Robert Smithson and things like this the year before. So that's just an aside note. I think, let's see, the first computer virus I really want to talk about. So this is later. This is after computer viruses are pretty established in the culture. And the PC is, of course, taking everything to a whole new level. But I think it's better to maybe start with this is the first Trojan virus that got out into the wild, as they say. And it was created by a gentleman named John Walker in 1974. So basically, in the 70s, there was a computer game called Animal. And it was a sort of 20 questions game. And the computer would ask you the question. You were supposed to have an animal in your mind, and the computer would ask you a question like, oh, does it have horns? And you say, no, it doesn't have horns. And it's like, oh, does it have fur? Like, no, it doesn't have fur. And it would try to guess, after 20 questions, what animal was in your mind. And it would remember your answers, so it would start to build an intelligence. And so it would change with every player. But a lot of programmers made this game and tried making it better. And so John Walker, he thought he made like the animal of all animals, like king of the jungle. He'd done it, and he was just ready to get it out into the world, but he didn't really know how to do that. He kind of knew how to do it, but basically he was working on a UNIVAC system, which was an early interconnected computer system that a lot of corporations used. It was developed in the 50s. And the way that they transmitted data gave data from one computer to the other outside of that system was through tape, magnetic tape. So he was sort of like, well, that's kind of like going to be really slow. So what he decided to do was to build another software program inside of Animal called Pervade. And what Pervade would do was go through, once you had this on your computer and you started up Animal, Pervade would go through every directory on that computer and download Animal onto it. Now, if you already had Animal, because it was a popular game, it would just override it with this new version. So the computer virus, at least in this instance, one of the earliest ones that sort of got out into the wild, was done because of questions of distribution and how to distribute a sort of in this case it's a game, but I think you could consider it a sort of cultural form or a creative form. And eventually what happened was, because many corporations use this UNIVAC system, and they traded data on these tapes. So the virus got on the tapes, it infected corporations, across the country. It was around for about a year before it finally disappeared with an update to the UNIVAC system. So, alien hand syndrome here. So the next, so you might ask, so what do these computer viruses have to do with poetry beyond this sort of superficial relationship to, graphic relationship to concrete poetry? And the answer sort of lies in another virus, which was the sort of first boot virus that got out into the wild. And this was in 1982, and it's a virus called Elk Cloner. The funny thing, it was created by this guy named Richard Skrenta when he was 15 on his Christmas break from high school. He was a freshman in high school. And basically what happens, he created this virus for those floppy disks. Does everyone remember those floppy disks that the Apple IIs used? And they have a little hole in the center. And so it was a virus that was transmitted through those, basically. And he installed it on his computer at school, and then anytime someone put a fresh disk into that computer, it would install it onto that disk, and then started infecting, basically ended up infecting about 1 million computers. And what's interesting about it, I guess, to this conversation is that it was a boot virus. So every time you booted your computer, the virus would come alive, basically. But it was only on the 5th time that the computer would actually shut down. So every 5th time you started your computer, the computer would shut down. And so it's like a very benign sort of trickster freshman in high school thing to do. Your computer just acts a little funny. But then he decided, well, I have to do something like when people reach the higher level of booting, I guess. So on the 50th, well, here's the source code for it, by the way. It's not so interesting. But on the 50th boot, it would the screen would go black, and up would come a poem. And so here's a poem called Elk Cloner. The name of the virus is Elk Cloner. And I'll just read it really quickly. It's not a great poem, mind you, but Elk Cloner, the program with a personality. It will get on all your disks. It will infiltrate your chips. Yes, it's Cloner. It will stick to you like glue. It will modify RAM 2. Send in the cloner. So here we have the first instance of a computer virus actually being used to distribute poetry. Now, the thing about computers is, since the very beginning, at least, one could argue since the very beginning, and depending on how you view what a computer was at the very beginning, but say post-World War II, the post-war computer, the idea is that it's going to store data, and then it's going to sort of try to recreate intelligence, artificial intelligence. And the true test for scientists, throughout time since then has been, well, if we can create artificial intelligence, what's the true test of the computer? And that, of course, is to build a computer that can write poetry, that can create the works of Shakespeare, that can do all these different things. And there is a set of computers that's being set up to think like monkeys, and they're just hammering keys to try and see how long it'll take to create a complete work of Shakespeare. And so far, after 4 years, I've gotten 12 words. But that's a whole other story. But anyway, so artificial intelligence. So this is one of the first computers that stored data. It's called the Mark I. It was created in Manchester, England. It's from 1948. But in 1952, they wanted to give it the true test, so they loaded it up with stock poetry and turned it into a love poetry generator. So here we have one of the first instances of a computer-generated poem. And granted, it's a love poem, and it's also not a very great poem, but I'm going to read it really quickly just because it seems like a great morning for love, I guess. So, darling honey, my wish cherishes your lust, my fervor fervently longs for your ambition. My sympathy cherishes your darling heart, my passionate sympathy tempts your hunger, you're my anxious enchantments. Yours ardently, MUC. And I don't know what MUC means. It might be the initials of the scientist who developed it. I'm not sure. And so here we see the computer generating poetry, which is sort of a rich history. I mean, it's sort of people, it's been around for a while, this sort of idea that computers can generate poetry or art or what have you. So I'm not going to go down that sort of history too much because it's kind of well documented, but there is one more that I want to talk about, and that is the auto beatnik poetry generator, just since we talked about Burroughs earlier. And this was done in 1962, so beatniks were all the craze, in the late 50s. So they developed a computer that could write beatnik poetry. And basically what they were trying to do was they developed this so that they could try to create they were trying to create artificial language, basically, or computers that could talk. So one of their ways of testing it was by trying to get it to write beatnik poetry. And so here's one beatnik poem by the auto beatnik. It's number 41. It's called Insects. All children are small and crusty, and iron can saw all dragons, and all pale, blind, humble waters are cleaning, and flying woefully is like closing sweetly. An insect dumb and torrid comes of the daddy-o. How is an insect into this fur? So kind of a fun, a little bit better maybe than the love poem. But then there's a great little story here that one of the bearded scientists took it to a beatnik cafe and read the poetry, and it sort of turned a lot of heads. They were super, super into it. So that's the history of a very brief synopsis of early poetry generated by computers. But then you also have poets in the 60s like Emmett Williams and Jackson McClough who are using the computer in a much more interesting way to sort of derive poetry. So we have just kind of a little recap here. We have Lord Timothy Dexter, and I might add Timothy Dexter, as you can probably imagine, was not born a lord. That's a self-proclaimed title. The first grammarless book, we have William Burroughs, Language is a Virus, Grammar is a Mode of Control. And then a few examples of the wedding of language and viruses in the real world. So having said all that, we kind of wonder, like, well, what are the implications of this? I mean, these are the questions I'm asking as an artist, as a publisher, and as a writer, and all this other, this sort of tick, tick, tick stuff that is on the resume. What are the ramifications of this? And I think in order to answer those questions, I just want to talk briefly about early conceptual art, because, as we all know, conceptual art, champions the idea over the sort of realization of that idea. And I think Seth Sieglob probably said this best when he broke conceptual art down into primary information and secondary information, with primary information being the most important, and that would be the idea, and the secondary information being the realization of that idea, either on a wall or in a book or in a magazine, in the case of Dan Graham, et cetera, et cetera. But at the heart of this is the idea of distribution. And conceptual art sort of joined a larger trend of dematerialization that was going on in the art world at the time. And Seth Sieglob, there was a lot of artists turning to books at the time that were maybe neo-conceptual artists, conceptual artists, but had maybe different agendas than the early first-generation conceptual artists, at least the American ones. But Seth Sieglob, who was not an artist, but was a gallery director and a curator of sorts, who was working with artists like Carl Andre, Robert Barry, Douglas Hubler, the early guys, the early bros. He sort of thought, well, if conceptual art is based on language, and the idea is the most important, then why do we need a gallery space to actually distribute the work? Why not just have a book? The work can be distributed inside of that, and we can conceptualize the book as an exhibition space. So here we have, sort of one sort of pillar of what ended up becoming the American artist book sort of scene. It's the idea of the book being reconceptualized as an exhibition space in and of itself that could travel far beyond the museum wall, far beyond the gallery wall. It could enter into pre-existing forms of distribution, such as paperback distribution. Something Else Press, Dick Higgins, he really wanted his books, Lucy the Pard, they wanted their books distributed next to Harlequin romance novels in grocery stores. So here we have sort of this, the reason why I wanted to talk about conceptual art was because it's based on language and it has a principal concern of distribution. Here's one of Seth Sieglob's early exhibitions called January. It's a piece by Lawrence Weiner. And there's two practitioners that I think about a lot, and in particular I think about these quotes a lot. And one is Vito Acconci, who sort of started off as a poet, became a conceptual writer, and then moved on to many other things, including video performance and later architecture, and just sort of ran through the gamut, basically. But in 1990, in the mid-90s, I think it was 95, 96, he did an interview with Liz Kotz, and he said language, it seemed like the perfect multiple in describing his work from the late 60s. And then we also have Douglas Hubler, who sort of echoes that by saying, this was from 1969, the world is full of objects, more or less interesting, I do not wish to add any more. And those comments and phrases, even though they're rather flippant, and I think in their intention, have always really resonated with me. And it sort of brings up the question of it begs the question, like, why does language, which is already a distribution system, need a secondary distributive medium or a secondary space, such as a book or a gallery, at all, if the end result is the exhibition of an idea? And then the next question for me, after sort of thinking about all these viruses, in particular syndromes and computer viruses, is it possible to impregnate an idea, which is already going to be distributed through language, with a self-replicating, mutating work, for instance, could be visual or linguistic, that functions as a virus, thereby distributing itself. Could this be a new model for poetic or artistic distribution? And these are just questions that that are bouncing around in my head and I've been trying to work out for many years and probably will be trying to work out for many years more. There is one thing we can look at is to try and answer that question, and that is the earworm. Everyone probably knows what earworms are. They're the songs that get stuck in your head. It can be part of a song. It can be a whole song. Some people can get a whole symphony stuck in their head. Some people just get a 3-second snippet. But it's thought that 98% of all humans suffer from earworms. So there are, it's gained a lot of traction, I think, in a pop culture way in the last 10 years. But there are writings about earworms that go all the way back to the Greeks, for instance. But it's become a sort of a new phenomenon. There's a lot of neuroscientists that are trying to figure out where the earworms actually reside in the brain, where that space is. And ultimately, for me, I think that's the space that I would like to try and figure out if we could start hanging works of art into that space, or writing lines of poetry in that space, like trying to find that space and trying to create work that can inhabit that space and then mutate out into a different form as it travels from person to person through language. So with that, I'm going to leave you, but not without first just leaving you with an image. This is the first of many lectures I'm going to be giving on this sort of subject. So the next place I'll pick up will be in a couple months in New York, and it's going to be on this computer system that's been developed recently in Europe called IMS. And I have no idea what this is, but it appears every time you type in the word IMS online. I think it's a logo meant to look like a brain. I'm not sure. But basically, IMS has written over 1 million songs already in the last few years, including symphonies that have been performed by major symphonies and orchestras in Europe. And right now, they are trying to create songs. It's being used essentially to create songs that will remind you of the jingles that you already hear in real life. So if you have like the Nokia jingle, for instance, it won't rewrite the Nokia jingle, but it'll analyze the structure and the algorithms of that jingle and then pump out 200 or 300 songs that play with that algorithm so that it recalls in your brain that Nokia jingle, so then you want to go out and buy a Nokia cell phone, which is really weird because it's not like people buy cell phones every day. You think that they would do this with like a roast beef or something like that, but it hasn't quite gotten that far yet. So this will be the next jumping off point and just something to think about, I guess, for all of you. So thank you very much.